Thank you very much for taking your valuable time to watch this video. I hope you find them valuable each week. You know, I'm passionate about investment real estate, and I'm passionate about you becoming very prosperous and wealthy by being a landlord. So I'm covering some of the principles of how to get there, and also some best practices and some pitfalls to avoid. And today I want to talk to you about evicting a tenant. Now that sounds counterproductive. We're in the business of attracting and retaining tenants, not evicting them. And certainly if we have a good tenant, we want to see them stay long term. It's costly and problematic for a landlord whenever a tenant leaves. You've got the repair that needs to be made between tenants. You've got the problem of showing it if the tenant's already there, or losing a month if you wait till he vacates. It's always a headache. So we want to keep good tenants. But what if it's not a good tenant? What if it's a problem tenant? There are times when you just have to evict the tenant. And there's provisions in the Residential Tenancies Act to do that. It may be they're not paying the rent, or it may be that they're behind in the rent. They pay some rent but not enough rent. They always seem to be falling behind, or they're slow in paying the rent. Instead of paying at the first of the month when your payments are due, they're chronically late. It could be that they're damaging the unit, or it may be that they're disturbing others in the unit. It could be that they're adding additional occupants than what is on the lease, and it's becoming problematic and maybe unhealthy. There could be a number of reasons why you need to evict the tenant. And as I said, the Residential Tenancies Act gives you provision to do that. But it's important that you do the right forms, and it's important that you use the right time frame. If you don't, then it'll go back to square one. You have to start over again. So for example, for non-payment, you use an N4. If it's interference that's the problem, then you can use an N5. If they're committing illegal acts, then you're going to use an N6. If there's serious problems they're creating in the unit, it's an N7, and so on. And you use these proper forms. What I want to talk to you today about, however, isn't a problem tenant. It's a situation where you, as the owner, landlord, sell the property, and the buyer needs the property for his own use. Now that's somewhat counterproductive, because I tell you in the money machine, never sell. And I believe that, never sell. But I also understand that properties have gone up tremendously in value over the last few years, and some of you looking at the equity that you have tied in that property may decide you need to get your hands on that money. Maybe there's pressing needs that you need to get, or more likely, maybe you've transferred with your job to Calgary and it's just not going to be practical to maintain rental property here. So for whatever reason you find you have to sell, you put a for sale sign on the property and you get an offer, but the buyer needs the property for themselves. There's provisions in the Act for you to give the existing tenant notice to vacate. Now, when I say need it for themselves, we need to be careful here. They can be for themselves, or they're for immediate family. And when I say immediate family, the Act is very specific. It can be the husband and wife, either of them if they're splitting up. It can be either spouse's parents. It can be either spouse's children. And that's it. It can't be aunts and uncles and cousins and best friends. That's the limit. There's one other thing, and that's for a caregiver. And this would apply if you have a multi-unit building, say a duplex or a triplex. Because if the caregiver requires accommodation, it has to be in the same building as the person who needs the care. So if it's a single family home, it wouldn't apply. But if you've got somebody who needs care and there's a secondary apartment and you need to provide a caregiver housing, then that's a reason that you can give notice. And the notice you give is called an N12. What it is a form that you would give them at the start of a payment period. In most cases, a payment period is once a month, and it requires 60-day minimum notice from the start of a month. Let me just interject something here. This is when the buyer wants to use the property themselves or for their immediate family. And it has to be for that reason. Sometimes they're buying on today's values and they want to increase the rent and they want to evict the tenant for that reason. That's not an allowable reason to evict a tenant. And you got to be very careful with strict penalties and fines if you give a tenant notice and it's under false pretenses. But let's suppose they need it for themselves. You give the tenant notice. You give them 60-day notice. Under this act, 60-day notice, he can leave after 10 days. He's not bound by the 60 days. And the reason for that is that the tenant, when he's been given notice, is going to be out looking for another apartment. And he may find something that's already vacant, and the landlord's not willing to wait 60 days, and he needs to rent it right away. So he's not going to be penalized for the 60 days. So he can do it much quicker than that. The other thing is under the Protecting Tenancy and Strengthening Community Housing Act of 2020, the requirement is there on the landlord to either pay the tenant as compensation 1 month's rent at the time the eviction takes place, or to provide him with another accommodation that's satisfactory to him. I want to also add that you can't break a lease. If there's a fixed term tenancy in place, it has to be honored. The new buyer may require the property, but the process of evicting them can only take place after the end of the fixed term tenancy when they become month to month. The challenge here that I want to throw out to you is what happens if you give them the proper notice, the 60-day notice, give them the N12, everything's done according to procedure that's laid down, and the closing date comes and the new buyer shows up in his moving van full of furniture and the tenant's still there. What do you do then? That's a real problem, and it's a problem we want to tackle next week. Thank you very much for taking the time, and I look forward to talking to you about that very specific topic next week.